Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. I have two guests today, and one is my friend Trish Wilson, who I talked to recently, and my other new friend is Bob Emiliani. Is that the correct way to say your name?
Yep, that's fine.
Very
yep.
good. And in putting this episode together, we decided that I would turn the moderation of the time together over to Trish. So Trish, take over and take us along a path towards wherever we're supposed to go today. Thank you.
Awesome. Drum roll, please. Yes, exactly. I think it's going to be really interesting because, Bob and I have known each other probably digitally for probably about 3 years, and we've met through the lean world, and I've just always enjoyed our conversations, but also his perspective on just leadership and change and improvement, and what we're all trying to do. Because you asked me a question in our meeting. You said, where are we at? Are we in a good place? Are we going forward? Are we making progress? And I said there's a lot of really good people out there, but they seem to hit a bit of a ceiling. There's a lot of good activity, but then it just doesn't get to that real impact level that we're looking for. And I've always found that Bob, in his work, he's got a perspective on, and it's a lot broader than this, and hopefully he'll go there as well, but they sort of a classical versus progressive management and leadership, and is the challenge a lot of how the mindset of leadership and what they're actually thinking, rather than what we're all wanting. There's a lot of people who want change and who are doing a lot of good work, and sort of how do we get that impact, and sort of what's getting in the way, I think. And we did meet and through the lean manufacturing sort of circles, but as I've sort of think improvement in its like broadest sense possible, the more I look at that, the more I think his work crosses all the boundaries. It can just go across improvement in general. So
can I ask a question? Can I ask a question, Trish? What is lean manufacturing? Because there'll be people that won't know what that is, that are watching or listening. So what does it mean? What does lean manufacturing mean?
Well,
I'll answer that. But I just want to make sure we're providing clarity on what the top ideas are.
I'll answer it, then he can, or you can answer it, because my impression so far is that lean or lean manufacturing, or all the other Six Sigma, all the ways you can improve, all the methodologies. People use them interchangeably, or some people say lean and mean continuous improvement broadly. Some people say lean and mean they're following the Toyota production system. It's a framework for how you improve, but yes, everyone's looking at it from a different lens. But most people, if they say, I'm going to get myself into trouble, so then I will definitely pass it on to Bob. But if they say lean manufacturing, are trying to follow a lot of what Toyota put in place with their Toyota production system, and their way of working through improving the business. But if you look at the Toyota production system, it's and this is what Bob, I was rereading Bob's stuff the other day. It's continuous improvement and respect for people, but a lot of lean then goes to tools that sort of more. Please.
It's a very confused situation. The people, 35, 40 years ago, the people who studied Toyota's production system, which really to that Toyota means more like their overall management system, but anyway, they gave it a generic term, a generic name called lean. And so basically, Toyota production system represents the current modern form of progressive management, as distinguished from the old way of doing things, which I refer to as classical management. Classical management still reigns supreme in this world, and a very small number of companies try to emulate Toyota's overall management system to lead in a different way and manage the organization in a different way, and have a different types of relationships with the various stakeholders. But lean has become a very confused term over the years, means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And generally it's lost its fidelity. Toyota is still sort of the icon that lean world looks up to, but the but Toyota's management system is not really so relevant anymore, because it is more like a focus on tools for improving processes at the working level, as opposed to higher level engagement with management, senior management. So we can think of it as just a current modern form of progressive management, which is Toyota's management system, and lean is like a derivative, westernized interpretation of that that's lost some of the connection to the original TPS.
Are you all familiar with Rhode High management? You familiar with that model?
No.
Okay, well, it's a model that was developed in China with the Mayer appliance company, which was
Oh, yeah. Okay.
the former
Yeah.
G company, and
Yep.
it's a progressive management system.
Yes, I can do that one. Yeah.
Well, okay, it's another form of this
Yeah.
progressive. Okay.
Yeah, and some are, some are complete systems, some are substantial but not complete, others are more like methodology within a larger framework of a system and so forth. So yeah, it's all very confusing.
So Trish, when you say we're hitting some kind of ceiling, what do you mean by that?
Well, I literally might pass it on to Bob about but no, well, I think you describe it just so well with the classical and progressive.
Well, I mean, let's say you're a small startup business and you want to do things differently. And your model as a startup business is Toyota, because they were once a startup business and thought differently about how to be a startup competing against much bigger established automakers and so forth. Well, if you have some success as a startup, pretty soon you're interacting with bankers who have a certain view of the world and how your business should be run, and the role of certain assets within your business that conflict with how you'd look at assets if you were following Toyota's model. You're going to be dealing with lawyers, you're going to be dealing with private equity and so forth. And pretty soon, before you know it, even though you want to try to manage your organization progressively, the whole world around you functions in the old style of thinking, which is heavily rooted in classical and neoclassical economics. So this is basically 17th and 18th century thinking carried forward to today. And so you're going to have to figure out, if you're a startup, how to run your business in a progressive fashion while always having this pressure from the outside and internally from whom you hire, because you're going to hire people with the old way of thinking and doing things, and unless you train them and give them a different mindset of where you're going to do things in your startup business, they're going to drag your business back into the old way of doing things. And you see this with happening in the Silicon Valley stuff, very progressively managed businesses at Google and Facebook early on, and over time they just become any other large corporation with lots of rules and procedures and managed in the typical way that corporations tend to be managed, and not necessarily the result of being a large corporation. There's many small companies, family-owned businesses that are run in a similar fashion.
Do you think it's the system and the structure that is stopping people being more progressive, or is it actually this a high percentage of people in the system that actually like that way of going about things and don't want to be progressive? Like, is it what's
in it for me to think differently? If everybody thinks one way, why should I bother thinking the other? The old saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, so why bother? Typically the people who do want to stick out are willing to take the consequences, because it's part of their personal and business exploration in life to think differently and do things differently. And they persevere and have whatever level of success or not that they engage with. But it's we put a lot of the effort on leadership, because we talk a lot about leadership because we have this mythology, I think, that they are the ones in charge and who can make the change, but they are not sole actors in this system. And so a president let's say they want to shift the business, a president or CEO wants to shift the business from the old way of doing things to a new, more progressive way of leading and managing the organization. You have, let's say it's a mid-sized business, and there's going to be 10 vice presidents, right? And the president might have a little mutiny on their hand if the 10 vice presidents are like, hey, why are we doing this? Why is it necessary? We're succeeding in the marketplace, we're making money, we're profitable, we're growing, and so forth. And even if we're not, even if we're suffering from low growth, poor profits, and so forth, why don't we just do what everybody else does, which is merge or acquire a business or spin something off or whatever? Why do we got to manage in a progressive way? How is that going to save us? So whether you're succeeding or failing, progressive management is pretty unattractive to most people. They're unfamiliar with it. They don't know it. It's a completely different set of preconceptions compared to the old way of doing things, which we grow up, in the world with those old way of doing things. You're 2 or 3 years old and you already have this notion in your head about status, rights, and privileges. Your parents have status, they have certain rights over you, and they tell you certain things to do or not do that they themselves go do. And so early on, you start to become aware of these, or these become your preconceptions. And as you get older in life, once you get your first job, you see how the workplace works, what's rewarded, what's not. You're pretty much acculturated to that way of thinking very early on. And you might question it in the beginning, but pretty soon thereafter, you're like, that's just the way it is.
So then is there only a small group of people who go, that might be how it is, but it isn't how it should be? So there's only a small group of agitators who are like, no, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, there's apparently a larger group of agitators with Generation Z. I don't know how successful they will be because, when you're young and you don't own anything and you're not really part of the system, you don't have a house, a car, a mortgage, etc. You tend to be more progressive in your thinking, and then later on in life, you have kids, car, mortgage, etc. You're in the system and things are different. But Gen Z does some very interesting things, like they'll ghost, when they're signing up for interviews or they get the job offer, and they'll just like not reply to things. And part of it is their attitude is, I want to be in control of my life, and I want to make decisions that are right for me and not follow in my parents' footstep to the extent that they just did whatever the company said. You had to get this job, you needed an income, you had to just choke it down, get kicked in the butt and just deal with it and so forth. And they have a different attitude about that. And some of this is, at least in an American sense, the product of, private equity and the 40 years of layoffs in the effort to maximize shareholder value, which is a term that's not used lately, in the last 6 or 8, 10 years maybe, but that's still what's in play.
Somebody was telling me last week that their Gen Z employees, don't ever see themselves owning a house.
Yeah.
And so because they don't have that, as you say, they don't have that part of the system, they're not in that part of the system, then they are making different decisions. They're like, oh, well, this is more important to me. I don't need XYZ money to do that, get a mortgage and do that part of things. But I was a millennial. I was one of those before it was a thing, even though I'm obviously not one by age. But I got hassled quite a lot, actually, for doing it, for not being part of the system, for changing jobs whenever all my people around me were not. I'm like, oh, you can't stick at anything, Trish, and got hassled quite a lot. But now I've actually got all the skills that mean I can do things differently, because you need a little bit of resilience and robustness and a bit of grit to be able to live like that.
I get hassled a lot for not being part of the anti-system, I guess. So you have the system, classical management, then you have lean world, and then there's me on the outside looking at both of these things and saying, things aren't right with either of them. But anyway, so I get a lot of hassle about that.
Well, I've always been the outsider, and I had the same experience as many of these young kids growing up. My father was an HR guy in a corporation, and come home and he would talk about work every night at dinner, and it didn't sound appealing at all.
Yeah, right.
And and so I didn't go into business, but how many years later, um, I became interested in leadership, and then ultimately I became a consultant to businesses, doing leadership work and strategy and problem solving. And so I was working on businesses instead of working in a business, and it was interesting, and all these things that you're talking about, the classical and the progressive management styles, and um, I've seen those up close and as a consultant, and what I realize is that they don't have much clarity about why they do anything. It's all a bunch of. I'm overstating this for effect, but in many ways, what's going on is that they are simply practicing the things that they learned to practice when they were young, and it's comfortable and this is known, and so they continue to do it, and without knowing whether it works or not.
Oh yeah, it's remarkable how, I tell people that Henry VIII was 17 generations ago, and you don't realize it, but we're probably thinking in the same ways as Henry VIII. And you can take it back to the pharaohs, and so that's 170 generations ago, and we're still doing things like the pharaohs. When the pyramid collapses, the pharaohs, blaming the architect and the builder, just like we blame people for mistakes today. And so these are long-lived traditions in the heritage of Homo sapiens.
But the question I have is, we're living in a time, in a context, a historical moment in time, which is different than it was 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 500 years ago.
Yep.
And the question is whether these old models can be sustained successfully in a time where everything is changing, and my own sense is it's not sustainable, and the progressive approach is not just a new idea that we ought to look at, but actually probably it's our way of surviving what the changes that we're going to go through.
Yeah, I'm not sure sustainability is something they care about, but they're going to fight. People who are part of that old way of thinking are going to fight to perpetuate it.
Right.
Now, I don't think the end game is sustainability. It's to hang on to what you got for as long as you can. And then there'll be a rupture at some point that will be uncorrectable, that there'll be some major change. But after that major change starts on its path of its life cycle, there will be people who will be dissatisfied with that and want to bring it back to the previous old way. So as you know, history goes in cycles, repeating with some similarities, obviously not exactly the same. So that's what I would expect to happen.
Are either of you familiar with Joseph Tainter, the anthropologist who has written a lot about the collapse of societies? He teaches at Utah State, and a lot of what he's done in the last 20 years or so has been focused on energy as kind of a determining factor in the success of society. And a couple of things he says, and it's really interesting. He says that societies that failed because they were really good at solving problems. And the problem was that all those solutions required more infrastructure and more to sustain the solution. And that at some point it became overly complex. And then he says, and we're at that in terms of the way we deal with energy, and that he says, we'll reach a point where the cost of creating energy will become so prohibitive that we will begin to fail as a society. I may be not saying it precisely the way he says it, but I see some of that kind of coming to an end, where it's not so much whether we choose to be sustainable, it's really a choice whether we're willing to simplify the way we do things, which I think will be one of the versions of a progressive management style.
Yes, simplification and subtraction rather than addition, because you look at Boeing and the door blowing off the aircraft, the answer there is um, uh, more inspections, just keep adding, just more inspectors and more inspections.
Yeah.
And what we learn in progressive management is something called Kaizen, which we look to combine and eliminate steps without making trade-offs against quality or lead time or whatever. But the other thing that you notice with Boeing is they have quality stand down days, which is when people are supposed to stop work and, have a particular focus on quality that day. But what they don't have is Boeing leadership stand down days, so that the leaders reflect and say, what did we do to create this problem in this company that's still with us, been with us for a few decades now. We're currently in charge. And being in charge means there's some things we can do, some things you can't. We assign more power to leaders sometimes than what they actually have. But you can have a leadership stand down day and reflect on what is the relationship between what's going on the shop floor and with the office personnel as well, and what's our leadership way of thinking and how we make decisions and how we engage the workforce and so forth, that's helping to cause this problem. Because surely the usual thing with most leaders is when there's a problem, it's obviously the people down at the bottom who created the problem. It's the bad apple and so forth, and people buy that, amazingly enough. The public buys it, but it's they're part of a larger system of things going on, so it's not an individual who's accountable, but they try to make it that way. Part of being a leader, find somebody else to blame.
How do you get that sort of a change with that situation? Because do you need a change of person? Like, is it leadership who think a certain way and you go and find leaders who are a bit more progressive? Because I remember when I went on some site tours and I'd hear all the good things that the operational people were doing. We expect this, we expect that, we're going to do this and that. There were some really good stories. And I said the similar thing. I said, well, are your leadership expected to use the same tools and think about things? And they went, no. Yeah. No, the leadership allow, or not allow it, but expect it, and it's part of how they manage. I'm like, no, but are they doing it themselves? And they just looked at me like I had 3 years and said no. And I'm like,
yeah, it's two different things. There's a group of people at the bottom, typically mid-level manager on down, that manage the processes, and above the mid-level manager, they're managing the business. And there's two different logics. And the technical logic of the people at the bottom is different than the business logic of the people at the top. And we talk about in progressive management world how scientific thinking applies up and down the org chart, but the reality is that above the mid manager level, you tend to get less and less scientific thinking and much more ad hoc thinking and much more political type of thinking, and how am I going to look and what's the effect on me and my leadership team and things like that.
When I became interested in leadership back in the mid 80s, and it was because I had a very positive experience working on a board where the board worked as one. There was no competition, that sort of thing. And I began to study leadership, began to read books on leadership, began to read biographies of business leaders, and I realized I disagreed with almost all of it for the very thing that you just described, is that it's a very the way we understand leadership in the world today ignores the fact that most of the leadership that's taking place is down in the trenches. And everything else is, I don't know how we call it. Is it the marketing of personalities? And that's not leadership, but that's what passes for leadership in many ways. And
indeed. And then it's widely accepted. And when leaders mismanage the business and lay off 10,000 people, everybody just accepts it like it's a natural course of things, when it's not. And people have become just acculturated to this, to think that this is good leadership. And people are not very good at questioning things. reporters, investigative reporter is a little bit different, but your typical reporter just reports on the layoffs, and the management gives the reason of whatever it is, usually something, not the accurate reason, or it could be like the tech layoffs. It's that are happening now. It's somewhat accurate. They'll say they overhired, but it's also a flexing of the muscle to tell people we're in charge. We're the ones who are going to tell you you can work from home or not, and you have to just, we're putting enough fear in you to gain your compliance and to recenter you back to our real world as leaders and get away from the COVID days of working from home and stuff like that.
And also capturing the talent from your competitors. I mean, that's another side of that. So
yeah,
it's a talent competition that goes on.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was that, but now that those people that they claimed they needed to hire because talent was scarce are all being released because obviously now they're not talented. So, I mean, this is the ad hoc nature of leadership. It's really seat of the pants, just thinking about what your problems are kind of day to day. And yeah, there's strategies involved and so forth, but there's just a lot of ad hoc, just kind of make it up as you go along. And that's different from the world of progressive management, which tends to be much more process oriented and more exacting. You can think of progressive management where it's done right as at a leadership level is more like craftsmanship. I mean, yeah, I've always characterized the classical management, the old way of doing things, which is 99.99% of the companies out there, is amateur level management because the mark of professionalism is not making mistakes. You can think of a musician, golf, fewest number of mistakes wins or is more highly regarded. And what you see, and just read the Wall Street Journal every day, and you find out all these mistakes and calamities and disasters that happen, Wells Fargo fraud, et cetera, Boeing 737, on and on it goes. And you find out that this is really amateur leadership that everybody thinks is good stuff.
How do you challenge it? And it's possibly something that I need to get better at is how do you proactively so that you bring some good change. And often I'm driven by, you're listening to a whole lot of people at all sorts of levels around you, and you're like, well, there's a lot of your answers as to how you're going to get some progress. I remember I did do a challenge one day, and the organization had set a budget, and then for external reasons they couldn't meet that budget, and so they were sort of here. They weren't losing money, but they weren't meeting the budget. And I said, well, are you going to change the budget? And they said no. And I'm like, it just made no sense to me, because it's like, well, that's not.
Yeah,
you laugh. You understand.
Yeah, when I worked in industry for 15 years before getting into higher ed and so forth, and I had that kind of management responsibility and so forth for that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's just absurd, people make commitments up and down the line within the business unit up through the CEO, and everybody thinks somehow that these guesses, which is all the budgets are, is just guesses, that this is going to be what actually happens. And of course, it's not what actually happens. And price of materials or labor, whatever changes, equipment breaks, you take care of your equipment, but if something still happened unexpectedly, rain came through the roof and landed on your equipment and so on. So there's all kind of stuff that happens. And yeah, there's an unwillingness to acknowledge reality. And this is immensely frustrating to people in the workplace, because, you have the boss telling you, the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, and be careful correcting them. And part of that reverse way of thinking is what you pointed out, is you can't re-baseline the budget. And there's plenty of people out there, by the way, who I forgot what it's called, different budgeting methods that basically rebudget every month. In the progressive management world, we would say you should rebudget every month or every quarter, because you can only guess so far into the future. But what you have to do is, since budgeting and rebudgeting is a pain in the neck, you have to develop a process so that a person who has budget responsibility can rebudget in 15 minutes. Not the process at my former university, where the budget was like a 15-month process. Yeah, it was more than a year, or when I started working in industry, we'd start working on the budget in October. And 15 years later, by the time I left, people started working on the budget in June. It's madness. It's going in the opposite direction.
Hmm.
It should have been going in the direction. You start working on the budget in October, and then a few years later, 6 or 7 years later, you improve the process. And now you started in November, then you started in December, and then you started maybe even in early January, because it only takes half a day for the whole organization to put it together.
Well, let me
But
ask
people don't think that way.
let me ask both of you this question. If we have such a pathetic culture of leadership in organizations today, how are they surviving? What is the secret for the success and the survival of all these corporations? I mean, they're not really failing. They're succeeding,
Right.
but they're not succeeding because they have great leadership.
Right. And you can
How are the
succeed. Sorry, go on, Trish.
Oh no, I was only going to just clarify, how are the organizations succeeding, or how are the leadership succeeding? How are the leadership?
The organization is succeeding. It's, I mean, you can think about all these companies that, I mean, Boeing is still selling planes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably not the best example, but people, it's as a leadership guy and have been for 40 years almost. Well, it's been 40 years. It's right now. It still befuddles me that we have such a dearth of good leaders, and we have really some strong companies and organizations out there that do really great things. So
it's clear that the leadership team is not responsible for the organization's success on a day-to-day basis. It's the people in the trenches who are getting the job done, whatever it may be.
yeah,
We always had, where I used to work, there's always the heroes at the end of the month or the end of the quarter that push the product out the door so you can make your financials and so forth. And it has nothing to do with, the leadership. You're successful in spite of leadership. I'm always reminded of the famous video of where the jockey falls off the horse at the start of the race and the horse wins the race without the jockey. Or the races where the horse wins in spite of the jockey.
yeah.
So you have that same kind of dynamic here going on. It's not to say, of course, leaders are totally useless and so on. They do some things that contributed to the success of the organization. But there's always those people down at the bottom who make it happen, and the heroes, which in progressive management, we don't like to have the people put in a position to be the heroes. But
Right.
In the old classical management world, you have all these heroes. And then, what is the leader? I mean, in the business where I used to work, the hero was responsible for making something happen to be able to ship a $3 or $5 million item out the door. And that hero gets, a little $500 appreciation. And if you're a leader, at the end of the year or something like that, and if you're the leader, you'd say, that's great. I mean, I made my bonus of whatever, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and all I had to do was cough up $500 a few times, 12 times a year to the heroes.
Well, let's talk about specifically in those kind of situations. What is it that these people are actually doing that we would call leadership? What are they doing so that $5 million project can get out the door? What are they actually doing to make those things happen? Because I think that's what people actually want to know. Because when I suspect, no, I don't suspect, I know that when we identify those things, they say, well, I'm doing those things. I said, well, that's why you're a leader. Oh, I didn't know that. That's what I find. So what are those things they should be doing?
Are you talking, and are you talking about what the heroes are doing or what the leaders are doing?
I'm talking about the people in the trenches, the people, the middle managers and the workers, because they're the ones that I think, Bob, you're describing as they're the ones who step forward when they take charge of the project and they make sure that the job goes out the door. I mean, that's what we're talking about. What do they actually do?
I'll tell you what, one of them that I worked with, amazing person, what she was doing, and it's wrong. But she was amazing. But how she was working 14-hour days to make it happen. She had a team, and she just also spent time thinking about all the team and what they needed, and would put herself out to look out for the team. So she was, I don't know, busting her ass. They had really good results. They were doing really good work. Customers really liked her. They liked the team. They liked what they were doing. But that's wrong. That was just wrong. You can't keep doing that. So that's what the heroes are doing. They're actually working their asses off to get around the system, to manage things. They cry out for, we need X, Y, Z, and don't always get it.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
She was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, they're the folks who know where to find whatever is missing that's necessary to complete the job. You know, in my world, it was physical parts, you know, because it was a manufacturing environment. But so that, you know, that's what they were doing. What the leaders were doing was essentially just applying pressure. You guys need to get this done. I don't care how you do it, you know, that sort of thing. And they, you know, they would pressure you in covert and overt ways and so forth to get it done. That cycle would repeat itself every month.
And they know that their job is on the line if they don't produce.
Right.
So it's not it's not totally by their own initiative. It's under threat, or it's under pressure, but that somehow that mix is unhealthy, is where I'm going with that.
Certainly is unhealthy. But I think I believe though, under their own initiative, because a lot of people who work in a company and who wear the company badge feel a certain loyalty and allegiance to the company. It's less so for Gen Z and so forth, but for boomers, what's left of them, and maybe millennials, somebody feels the need to you know, get the job done, and you know, so the company looks good and prospers and so forth. And you know, it's like, you know, you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan with the jersey on, and it's the same thing with your badge on. And so people will rise to that with or without the pressure. But there is, you know, typically the pressure is in place. But you know, when you see the kind of leadership where the answer to all problems is lay people off close plants and squeeze suppliers for lower prices, you know, you can say, well, what do you need an MBA for to do that? What do you need a college degree to do that? What do you need a high school degree to do that? Junior high? Probably not. Elementary school? Yeah. Third or fourth grade, you give a kid a card, get in trouble, lay people off close plants, squeeze suppliers, repeat as necessary in whatever order makes sense at the moment. And, you know, you have a third grader run the company.
That's great.
You know, I mean, it's just, but people accept this like it's normal.
Mm.
Yeah.
How do we change that? How do we change the fact that, yeah, people just, there's this group going, this shouldn't be normal, let's change it, and there's other people going, this isn't right, but then they don't.
What I see missing is there's nothing, you know, let's go back kind of in the old days. You had the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so forth. You could put a full page ad in there to say, you know, this is wrong, this is stupid, right? You could have done that back then. Now you have such a fragmented media thing, but you could air commercials on TV. And people do create movies and television shows like The Office to point out the absurdity. But you have to go the step further. In the Office, you're pointing out all the absurdity, but then you also have to have some editorial associated with that show at the end of each show with some text that says, you should, you know, this is absurd, but it's a reflection of reality, and you should grow tired of that, or you should grow, what's the word I'm looking for? You should be less accepting of that sort of stuff. It happens in your company. And so, but right now, the audience, you know, I mean, the audience I reach with my books is a niche of a niche of a niche, you know? I mean, you have the world of leadership and management books of the traditional type, Simon Sinek or whatever, Tony Robbins or Covey and so forth. And then you go down a few layers, and then you get into, you know, lean world. And, you know, that's a very tiny audience of people. And most of those people are sort of lower level working type of people. You have to reach society much more broadly. That's been one of my criticisms of progressive management. You fail to engage labor unions. You fail to engage society more generally. So how are you going to go someplace if you're in your own echo chamber for 35 years with lean, going 36 now? And progressive management generally has a history back to scientific management and Fred Taylor. There was that same echo chamber then. Although they did better actually than we did, I think, today in terms of they ended up in those days in the 1920s and 30s, 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Those ideas ended up in some federal policies. And part of the New Deal, which some people don't like and still hate these days. But anyway, point of it is the scientific management movement produced ideas and influencers that ended up in government that shaped, at the time, President FDR, I guess, policies. You don't see a similar thing coming out of lean.
Mm.
So everybody criticized Frederick Taylor and scientific management mostly from a point of ignorance, but they don't understand that output, made it into federal policy across a range of different things, not just in a certain area, but other areas.
And
They didn't get all they wanted, but by a long shot, but some stuff ended up in there.
well, in the world that Frederick Taylor was operating in and FDR was operating in is not this world at all. I mean, it was
Right.
it was a pre-information age. It was very much an industrial world that was changing. I mean, mid-century, it was changing to much more
turn of the century, really.
And yeah, and now we're in the information age, as Peter Drucker calls it, and it's totally different, and yet we haven't figured out how to adjust. And
right,
unless you have no background in working in a corporation like me, I don't have any background in corporate work. I've worked for people, but I found that I don't work well under people. Because I have ideas and I have things to say, and so the last job I had was working at a college, and I was basically knew it was time to go when I was accused of being too presidential. And I said, no, I'm just doing my job. But there you go. It's I was so I guess what I see that is so interesting about this is that there are two deficiencies in our society. One is the ability to delve into the intellectual nature of lean and all those different variations of that philosophy of management. And it's a philosophy that has a practice to it, which I think has extraordinary value for the future of the world. So, but the intellectual nature of that requires you to think and to spend some time in thought and to be engaged in conversation about these ideas. And the other thing is that people are unwilling to make decisions for themselves. They're very prone to following whatever the trend is, and the trend gets set by whatever is on social media. And that has had, I think, a very difficult, a very challenging effect upon businesses. I look at small businesses, and they're trying to mimic what these social media influencers are doing, and it doesn't work because I guess what I come back to is that it's not relational. Ultimately, progressive management becomes relational in character. Right. And if you don't know how to have a relationship with someone, then you're going to have a difficult time working in an environment where relationships matter.
Yeah, and classical and neoclassical economics, which is deeply embedded in how people think, is focused on individualism.
That's right. So it's a fascinating thing. So I'm wondering where you see us in 10 years. You got a sense of where, if these things are are good things for us to focus on and develop and encourage businesses to adopt. How do we do that? But more importantly, what would be a good goal for us to kind of aspire to for 10 years out that would allow us to say,
those are different questions.
I know there are.
Yeah, where we'll be in 10 years, what I see happening is a sort of tightening of the grip of the old way of doing things under the aegis of, the sort of second generation or third generation now of the information age. So, yeah, hope, maybe I'm wrong, whatever, but, a goal of where we'd like to be is to be whatever that magic tipping point is that says the way we've been doing things in the past is no longer suitable for now and in the future. And I don't know what that tipping point is, but to me, the goal would be to get to that tipping point or discover that tipping point, because there was a quote today. Where was it? Something like, neoclassical management makes perfect sense, but it's completely, from a logic standpoint, but it's very destructive of Mother Earth and of people and so forth. And yeah, it's a new book by a guy. It's about called Adaptive or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that progressive management has a significant role to play in the future. But if you look carefully at what the politicians and what the business people say, the answer to any problem they have is technology. So it's not relational. It's technology. It's a thing.
Right.
It's not people sharing a mindset, sharing some sacrifice, thinking of others instead of self. That's not the answer to any problem, according to business leaders, economists, and politicians, at least from the American perspective.
Yeah. What do you
And
think?
technology alone is not the answer. You need you need things in combination. It's technology and a new conceptualization of leadership and management. Technology and that and something else. You hear about it. There's articles now about geoengineering the planet. Putting sunshades out there, whatever. There's zero conversation about conservation. Zero. Small things you could do. Go to the butcher, get the meat wrapped up in paper instead of going to the refrigerated section and get the meat that's wrapped in plastic with a plastic tray and the diaper below the meat.
Right.
I don't know, Trish, I don't know what it's like in New Zealand for you, but convenience is very environmentally damaging, and of course it adds cost. But just wrap it up in butcher paper, go to the butcher. Butchers are nice people. If you're a vegetarian, then, we put things in a paper bag or reusable bag, whatever. But there's a lot of small things you can go do. We don't need to be drinking water out of a bottle all the time. A plastic bottle that we buy. There's lots of small things that people can do to conserve, but that's not part of the conversation. And recycling in the U.S. is kind of a joke because most of that stuff gets thrown out, which you put in the recycle bin.
Yeah.
So, we're not, creative thinking seems to be waning in all areas except tech, what some people call surveillance capitalism. There's a lot of creativity there, and with developing artificial intelligence and things like that. But in sort of your blocking and tackling stuff of the world, we're not talking about the ball handlers, the quarterback and the receivers and the running backs. And we're talking about just kind of the blocking and tackling of what we can do for ourselves in this world. There's
Yeah.
not much creative thinking.
Trish, you want to kind of bring our
Yeah. What's the New Zealand perspective on all that?
Oh, in 2 minutes. Oh, well,
Take 3.
I think we're probably doing some quite good social things, or trying to, but I think we're not having those big conversations exactly what you're saying. We're not en masse trying to create something differently. There's a piece of what do you call it? Recycling, there's recycling changes, and how do you collect, food waste. That's now a thing in my city, like collecting food waste, so that's decrease what's going to landfill. So that there's a lot of projects, I think, going on. Overall, we've got quite a conservative political party at the moment, so I think the leader seems quite, I don't question his heart, but it's quite traditional rather than sort of like where do we take it in the future.
Yeah.
And I think I like what you're talking about, the goal. I would say, I actually would reiterate what you're talking about, because I think it's about being more human. How do we be more human? Which is that relational piece. And I think we're not at that tipping point yet. We're still at this little, they're digging their heels in, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, but we have to change. And there was 3 things that struck me. One is like, how do we celebrate the people who are making change? And I was talking with a really cool young man, engineer in a company today, and he said he's leading the change, and he's leading the thinking. I'm like, that's so cool. And it's I think it's about 30 people in the company. It's like, how do we support and celebrate those people? Because the more we do that, and put the iron filings together, you get that sort of strength of base building up. And there was an article I read today, or LinkedIn post, and led me to an article, and I'll send it to you guys. A lady called Rachel Happe, Happe. She's in a lot of community management, does a lot of good stuff. But she was talking about the relational economy. So we've gone moving from a knowledge economy to the relational economy. But I had some really big questions out of that, because we're still not changing the money system, and even the progressive system. We're not changing how people get paid. We're not changing the whole trading system. So until we change that or look at that, people are like, well, I'd love to make a different decision, but I can't, so yeah. And there's not a lot of conversation about that, I don't think. No. But it was an interesting article. It did say that AI is going to mean a lot of the tasks are taken over there, so you have more time for relational thinking. But yeah, if you haven't.
Yeah, I'm not a believer in that outcome. I mean, I think that's the current excuse to assuage people's fears that they'll be out of a job.
I agree with you.
There was an article some years ago. Let me see if I can find it here quickly, in the New York Times, about a Davos conference, and the title of the article was "The Hidden Automation Agenda of the Davos Elite," and that was from 2019. And I've seen this tune before with technologies and so forth. And if you know the history of the introduction of technologies, that things are said to make you feel like it's not going to be a big impact on you, and then it ends up being a big impact on you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that all these changes are happening, and it may be that the best thing for us to do is learn how to respond to them, and respond to them in a collaborative way, and I think that to a certain extent requires us to be as locally oriented as we can, where we build direct relationships where we can care for one another when the bottom drops out. If the bottom drops out, then we are there to care for one another. I had a young man knock at my door today asking if I had any work for him to do. I said, not now, but maybe in the spring. And, I think that's I expect to see more people like that. I have people overseas that write me for that same thing. They said, can you send me some money? And I said, I can't send you any money. That's not a very good use of my money. It's not a good use of your sense of what is possible. You have to build community there where you find the resources there, but that's a very difficult call to make. So I think the times are going to be hard, but I think, and I guess this is the last thing I'll say. You say what I have found since the end of the pandemic was an openness to consider new ideas, and that has led to greater openness to be willing to be in conversation. And when we're actually in conversation, we have the opportunity to learn, and we have an opportunity to grow and build lines of support between us. And I see that happening, and that's what's happening with this podcast, is that there's, I mean, it wasn't really intentional on my part, but the things that people are responding to are, we like being able to talk without there being a topic, that we're not forced to talk about something. We could talk about anything we want to talk about. Okay, I like that. And the other is that all the people that, almost everyone that comes on the podcast are people that have been introduced to me or I've met through some other means. And very few, maybe 2 or 3, are people that I saw something about them on LinkedIn and I reached out to them and said, I'd like to have you on, just because of what you're talking about. So I think that there is a growing move towards greater relational interaction, and the trick will be how we transfer that into organizational settings where some of that can begin to have a beneficial effect.
Yeah. Well, that, I think what you said is important, and we need to have those kind of relational activities happening. But what I see in the business world is a lot of exclusion. So, for example, unions have been, to take an example, unions have been reduced to virtually nothing, and they're not part of the conversation about artificial intelligence. A community of interest such as nurses, physicians, and hospital staff are not part of the AI conversation as this stuff is being created. So a lot, and a lot of the engagement of top leaders in a company is with people at lower levels is performative. They'll meet with these people to hear their concerns, but they don't have a piece of paper and a pencil with them to write down some of those concerns. It's just show up, listen, and leave, and likely say something to their admin aide that's, I really hate doing these things, or something like that. But the voice of the employees is less and less heard, and you see it now with the clampdown post-COVID of internal message boards, as well as now you can't work from home anymore. You got to be here 5 days a week, etc. So in some arenas, the relational stuff is going in the opposite direction. Not all, of course, but in some arenas it is, some important arenas.
Well, it's going to be an interesting time going forward, and I appreciate you both being here. I hope this has been beneficial to all you all have watched this or listened to this. I think these are to find people who have really deep thoughts about the way we do things in businesses and organizations, and I think they're worth listening to. And glad to have you on, and glad to have you back again, Trish. I think we've found that we share a lot in common. And Bob, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you've done and the insights that you bring to these to this world of management. And I hope that people will listen to you, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ed, for having me on. Trish, thank you for getting me on.
Yeah, I knew it would be an interesting conversation, interesting, synergy.
It's nice to see you again. Nice to chat with you again. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Building those relationships.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone, for watching or listening. And please sign up and give us a like button, hit, and leave a comment if you would, so that we may know what you think. And if you have questions, please ask them, and I'll pass them on to Trish and Bob, and we'll continue the conversation as we move forward. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time here on the Eddy Network podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you.